Hi, I'm Wasim, CEO of Pilot. Thanks for joining us today. I have with me today Sara Adler. Sara, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Sara is a co-founder and general partner at Wave Capital, an early-stage venture firm that specializes in marketplaces. Prior to Wave, Sara had an extensive career in corporate development at Facebook, Dropbox, and Airbnb, where she was its head. So, Sara, thanks for being here. It's great to have you. So I'd love to know, actually, let's take it back to the beginning. What led you to corporate development in the first place?
Well, corporate development is kind of an interesting field, and it does vary from company to company. The type of corporate development I was a part of was really mergers and acquisitions, which is a pretty unique skill set to bring into a company, and really comes down to working with founders of startups and helping them navigate their journey into the larger organization, but also helping the company you're a part of figure out what is the right use case for M&A, and when does it make sense and when doesn't it. And coming into that, I came from venture capital actually, so I'm coming back full circle. But what I loved about venture was working with founders. You guys are a unique breed, and I felt like it was something that I wanted to keep, but I wanted to be part of a bigger company. So corp dev I kind of stumbled into, and when I joined Facebook, I was one of the first two people on the corp dev team there, and it was the really perfect blend for me to be able to kind of match that skill set of working with entrepreneurs, but also helping a bigger organization navigate what it means to do M&A. And I do think that there's a lot of parallels between the venture and M&A world, a lot of differences as well, but that's the long short of how I got into it.
Sure. And now you've seen this at a bunch of places. You've talked to lots of different startups and founders about just the process of being acquired. When first-time startup founders think about the acquisition process, are there things you think they often get wrong?
There are, and I think I will back up and say it's kind of an unfair proposition because most entrepreneurs maybe will do a couple of acquisitions of selling their own company in their entire lifetime, whereas the person that's doing corp dev, that's their full-time job. So it's a little bit of an asymmetric situation. So I will say this with really just trying to be helpful. I think oftentimes the perception is such that it's a transaction. A lot of people give the advice that you really just want to get as many bids at once, drive the transaction as quickly as possible because you're really just trying to view it as a pure play negotiation. But the reality is there's humans as part of it. So if you look at any of the large acquisitions that have happened at any of the companies that I've been a part of, or others in the Valley especially, it really comes down to the people at the top of each of those companies. So it's about relationships, to be honest. All of the big deals, even though the headlines might say they happened overnight, and sometimes literally they happened in a weekend, transaction-wise, the relationship building happened for years beforehand. So I think that one of the most important and often misunderstood things is that you have to start building those relationships very early on in the process because you don't know where your company will go. It could be that you will take the company public. It could be that you decide you never want to exit and you want to be private forever. But if you do ever want to have an M&A alternative, if you don't have that kind of relationship building with the senior executives at the potential acquirer, chances are it's just not going to be a successful outcome. And chances are if you get to a place where you really need to sell, it's just not going to end in the way that you want it to.
Sure, that makes total sense. And in terms of how to build those relationships, is that something that you think startups can do, or does the company that's potentially interested in acquiring have to reach out? Like if you were a startup and you decided, hey, the time is right for an acquisition for us, are there things you would advise a company to kind of help get the wheels in motion on that, or is that even possible?
I mean, first I would say before you get to the point of we need to, I would advise people to start the process even long before they think they need to. M&A processes can take at minimum 2 months, much longer for larger companies that are just not interested in moving quickly, which happens quite often. So, if you think you have a 3-month window to sell your company before, you run out of money or anything like that, you have some deadline in place, that's like the minimum amount of time that you need. But I think the main advice I would give is you want to get to the decision maker and in as organic a way as possible. This is maybe kind of, now that I'm out of the corp dev world, actually this was advice I gave anyway. Corp dev people are actually typically not the decision makers in the process. So
Sure.
The way that it typically works is you're interfacing as a corporate development professional with the deal sponsor in the organization. And that's usually someone on the product or engineering or business side of things that is making the decision ultimately, as they should, because they're probably the ones that are going to be helping integrate and manage the larger team that comes in after the acquisition is closed. And so that's the person that you want to be building the relationship with. That might actually be the founder of the company, of the acquirer. It might be one of their lieutenants. It might be someone lower down. But you want to figure out how to navigate who is that right person and be building that relationship, as opposed to spending time with the corp dev team, who's really, the job of the corp dev person is really to help navigate the process, make sure that the evaluation is happening in the right way, that the negotiation then is happening in the right way, but the decision-making process is not going through them.
Sure. And in terms of how to get in front of these decision makers, are there is it generally you want a warm intro from someone in your network? Are there avenues, do you think, for reaching these people that are particularly effective, or by contrast, that are particularly not effective?
I think warm intros are always the best in general. But that being said, I think that there are some people that, it's such a personality-driven thing. So it's hard to give it an exact answer. I've worked with some deal sponsors or product leaders or business leaders at companies who would receive a cold email and be really excited to just chat. I've worked with some people who would adamantly never talk with someone who reached out cold. So I think it's probably always best to do a warm intro if you can. But if you can't, I think you can navigate your own way through.
Sure. And do you think it's fair to say that companies are in general bought, not sold? In other words, that the company doing the acquisition has to be the one really in the driver's seat? Or do you think it is possible for an early stage startup to actually pique the interest of a large organization?
I definitely think it's possible to pique the interest. I think it's probably not a surprising answer, but if you're doing incredibly well, that's what's going to do it, right?
Sure.
If you either have a business that's on fire, if you have escape velocity of your user base, if you have a piece of technology that is irreplaceable and hard to replicate, these are talent that's incredibly impossible to find. Those are all ways that you can separate yourself from just the rest of the opportunities that any acquirer is looking at. I think the misguided perception is that you can force interest by just having a process that is put together. That can work sometimes, but more often than not, acquirers are going to be patient. And if it's not the right opportunity and you're forcing a decision in a very short time frame for them and they don't know you, they're not going to take the risk. It's very easy for them to say no, unless there's some other data point that indicates to them this absolutely has to happen. Because they probably think, well, there's a lot of risk on the integration. So in addition to paying a lot of money, there's integration risk and a lot of work that is going to be required to integrating this company, which is going to take away from my product roadmap. So, for all intents and purposes, if this feels like a gun is pointed to my head and I have to make a decision, the answer is going to be no. Which is why, if you can build those relationships early on, it's not a fast decision because you've actually been thinking about it, probably in the back of your head, whether or not they admit it along the way.
Sure. And if there is some acquisition interest and the process is kind of starting, do you have any tips for startup founders about how to navigate the process, either kind of generally or pretty tactically, about things you definitely recommend they do or things you recommend they avoid doing?
Yeah, I think, again, a common misperception is that you want to always make sure that there is a very short time frame and that, not to say that there shouldn't be multiple bidders, but that is the most important thing. You should absolutely have multiple bidders if you can have multiple conversations that are happening. But what I often have seen happen, and I think is a mistake, is to not be genuine. It usually comes out pretty clearly if, again, you're negotiating against someone who's a professional and they do it for a living. So if you come in and I've seen many founders do this where they're, touting that they have, a term sheet in place and they're about to make this decision with this other company, chances are I've bid against that other company before and I know their processes and I know that that's probably not true. So that loses trust in me and that then makes me lose trust in the kind of relationship building that I've had along the way. So I think being genuine and being honest is definitely a very important part of it. Because if you think about it, you're going to be colleagues with these people after all is said and done. So you want to make sure that you're not, and that should go for the corp dev person. Hopefully they're also being honest. But you want to make sure that you're starting the relationship off right. I think the other thing is you should give a sense of what the timeframes are. Don't hide anything from that perspective. Obviously, you can't share all of the details on your side of the table in terms of what another offer looks like, et cetera, because there's non-disclosure agreements, et cetera. But I do think that it is fair and helpful for a corp dev person to understand what the timeframes are. So if you say, listen, I have engaged with this other company, I probably have another 3 weeks until the decision is going to be made by them. So do you think that's a reasonable time frame? That's probably the reality versus, and that's going to sit much better than I actually have the offer in hand. Do you think you can get back to me in 3 days? The answer is, in that case, definitely going to be no.
Sure. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think you're right that a lot of people don't think about the acquisition actually not as the end, but actually as the beginning of their tenure at the company, that you're going to see these people every day, that you're going to work with them, and that being overly adversarial is not helpful to the process. It's actively harmful.
It's actively harmful, exactly. And I just think that, and this kind of segues into more negotiation styles, but I do think that you just want to be honest. Like and trustworthy, because otherwise, if you lose trust on either side at any point in the process, the chances that the deal goes sour are very high.
Sure. Are there particular deal points that you think founders don't pay as much attention to as they should, or things that perhaps they negotiate on overly aggressively that are probably not as substantive, like once the deal is done?
There are a lot, and things get usually pretty heated over a few terms, and obviously these are somewhat going to be specific to different states and stuff. California, though, whether or not there are non-competes in place is a big one, and understandably that can be very contentious with the acquirer and the target. And that's actually one that I think is worth paying attention to, of course, but I think again, it usually comes back to trust, and whether or not you think someone will fire you for no reason, and then you're out of a ton of money because it's being vested over a certain time frame. You've got to actually, you can put as much legalese together as you want, but ultimately it comes down to, do you believe this acquirer, and do you believe the relationship that you've built with this acquirer over time? Which, again, I'm going to sound like a repetitive person again, but I do think that's where, if you've only interacted with this startup or acquirer for 2 weeks, 2 days, how are you going to trust them? You really can't. And so I think that's where things fall apart pretty easily, is it gets pretty heavy pretty quickly in terms of non-competes or accelerated vesting for different clauses. And it really does come down to building that relationship up front. And maybe the answer is, as the startup founder, I don't trust this acquirer. And that's a good thing to figure out long before the deal is done.
Sure. And if you don't trust them, maybe that's not a good home for you or the company.
Absolutely. And you should back out long before the deal's done and figure that out, because once you are at the company, the worst case scenario on both sides is you're not happy. And I think that comes down to, were the alignment and expectations set up front correctly? And that's, again, coming back to kind of being honest and being transparent. If any acquisition that happens where it was not very clear what the expected outcome and the ideal outcome was going to be, that's where it just fell apart. And everyone was upset, because no matter what, the acquirer's looking at this as, I'm wasting money on this opportunity. I've wasted time. I've been excited emotionally, and all of a sudden it didn't work. I'm going to blame that on somebody. It's just a terrible outcome. And then for the startup, this was their startup. This was their baby, and all of a sudden they handed it over to this acquirer who's not happy with it. And then they're going to be upset and leave. And so it's just a really bad outcome for both sides. So I do think that it's a bit of a misperception that it's really just on one side or the other that you're optimizing for things. You want to be transparent on both sides. For the startup, they should be transparent with what they want for the acquisition. And for the acquirer, they should be transparent with what they want. And sometimes they aren't going to match, and that's great. We should totally leave it and table things. And when they do, it's pretty rare, but that's when it's a wonderful acquisition.
Sure. And speaking of things falling apart, can you walk us through just kind of the pipeline? I've talked to many founders. They get the initial email from someone in corp dev, and they're like, "Oh my God, company X wants to acquire us. They'll probably give us an offer tomorrow." Can you just kind of tell our viewers sort of about how the process typically works and what typical timeframes might look like?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of two aspects that a company can kind of a startup can come into a larger company discussion. One is the startup is soliciting acquisition interest, and the other is a larger company is actively reaching out to a startup. Usually, I would say, again, the corp dev person, remember, is not the decision maker. So if the corp dev person is reaching out, that's not a bad sign, but don't get too excited, because it means that they're ultimately going to have to figure out who the right decision maker is internally if they haven't already, or if they have, there's just another big gatekeeper to get through. But usually the initial step, regardless, is to have an introductory meeting. Sometimes it will just be with the corp dev person or corp dev team. Sometimes they'll already loop in the right product or business person that will be the deal sponsor. And from there, it's kind of that's like the triage point. So they're making the assessment of, is this worth investing more time for our team? And they're also making the decision of, what type of deal is this? Is this a deal where we are going to be focused on bringing the team on board? Is it about the technology? Is it about the business opportunity and the user base? And once they kind of figure out what type of acquisition it is, they're going to have a better sense, and the corp dev team is really going to help that business partner with figuring out what the right evaluation process is. And that's a really good point as a founder to ask the question of, what does the process look like? Because
Sure.
After that meeting, the corp dev person should have a pretty clear sense of, okay, well, if it's the team, we're going to need to interview the founders or the entire team, and here's what that's going to look like and what the time frame will be. If it's technology, well, we're going to have to do a lot of technical diligence and a lot of deep dives and actually testing it, et cetera. That might take months. If it's the business, et cetera. So I think that really does vary depending on what track the acquirer is interested in. And then, they're, depending on the acquiring company, of course, there are very few companies that get from that initial meeting all the way to an offer. So, just like when you're raising money, there are very few investments that get made by a given firm, probably. It's similar, very, very few companies get acquired. And so I would say you don't want to get your hopes up. And the initial email is great because it means that it's interesting, but it can be a distraction. In fact, I'd say the M&A process is probably one of the most distracting things, because I say that about the financing event, but M&A is a bigger decision, because you're deciding, do I want to go this alone or do I want to join forces? And so I do think that it's important to make a very big decision of, do I want to even engage in that process? Again, that's different than relationship building. I think engaging in a process means you are formally deciding, this is the time for me. Having a conversation and having that initial meeting might be worth it. But it's kind of after that initial point that you should really assess, is this the right time for me to explore this?
Sure. And actually on that topic, do you have a sense, just even like a rough ballpark? Okay, and I know it varies by company, but a given firm may have 100 conversations and then actually do one acquisition, or is it 10? Or do you have a sense of kind of what a ballpark ratio of
It's probably about 5%.
So pretty small.
Pretty small.
Yeah.
Pretty small. Yeah. So that's why you just shouldn't get your hopes up. But that's for good reason. It could be that the acquirer said no. It could be that the startup said no. So it comes from both sides, but it's a very low percent.
Sure. And hand in hand with that, I think, is also kind of from the founder's perspective, managing the psychology of the team. As you mentioned, sometimes this involves like founder interviews or a bunch of tech diligence or actually interviews with your entire team.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for founders on, okay, you're considering this option, how all in should we go on this, or to what extent should we let this distract us from our core business?
Yeah, I mean, that's a personal decision, I think. And I've seen it happen both ways. I've seen some founders say, listen, I'm going to shield my team entirely. They cannot know about this happening until we get to a point where an offer is going to be made. There are some situations, though, where that's just not an option. I mean, if it's purely for the entire team and assessing the entire team, you have to be able to do that in order to present an offer. So I think that's where it comes back to, the founders have to make that decision of, is this really the right time? And do we need to do this? Do we just really want to do this? And how do we feel about kind of opening Pandora's box? Because it's kind of hard to shut. And I do think that the risk of bringing the entire team under the kimono is that you can't really turn back from that. And I think the morale decision and question is a real one. And whether or not I've also seen situations where, even if the deal didn't work out for whatever reason, some of the employees of the company reach out to the acquirer saying, hey, I actually really enjoyed chatting with you guys. Are you interested in just having me join? And that puts everyone in a really awkward situation. So I think it's a thing, it's a one-way door, usually.
Sure, just managing the psychology of the
Absolutely.
team, because they start to imagine themselves being at the company, or like what the outcome is going to look like.
Totally. Or they start to question, is this startup viable? should I start looking for another job because it looks like we're looking at, team acquisition options. That's not really something that I'd planned on. I thought this was going to be a huge success. So now I'm going to spend my time somewhere else. So I think it really calls a lot into question. And it's very hard to manage that morale over a long period of time. So if it's a very drawn out process, it reduces the likelihood that the entire team will stay intact.
Sure.
Which an acquirer does know, to be clear. So they should be incentivized to move quickly, but big companies are big companies, so.
and speaking of big companies, I mean, you've seen many corp dev deals at Facebook, at Dropbox, at Airbnb. Would you say that they had were there similarities or differences in the styles that they had in evaluating companies and acquiring companies?
Very similar, and that's kind of what drew me to each of those companies, in that they were very product driven in their M&A strategies. I think a lot of that happens to be very correlated with the stage of the company that they were in. So when I was at Facebook and Dropbox and Airbnb, they were all kind of in that, Dropbox is a little smaller, but in the 1,000 plus range, but less than 10,000 employees. So going through hypergrowth in a phase where, product strategy was the most important thing in the company. And hiring was really insane, and talent was hard to come by in certain types of skill sets. And so the types of acquisitions that we ended up doing were both very team-based, but also very product-driven in terms of who the decision makers were and really who was driving the strategy behind doing M&A at all. I'd say the difference is, and this is true of any startup, M&A really is a very big part of a CEO's mindset, and it should be, whether it's a small deal to start or a big deal that you get to. It's something that you really should have the buy-in of the founders or the CEO, and I think that's a fair question that I would have if I were a founder going through a process is, whether or not they meet the CEO, depending on how big the company is. Understanding the mindset of the founder, I'm going to assume the founder CEO is the one at the top because that's the companies I've been a part of. Understanding where they're coming from and how they view M&A, I think is very important and will be very indicative of what the integration process will look like.
And on the topic of the integration process, have you found that there are things that lead to that being very successful, or on the contrary, things that lead to the integration being very unpleasant and painful?
Yeah, and integration is... It's funny, integration shouldn't start right after the deal is closed. It really should start as soon as you are in the evaluation process and making the decision. And it's often the less sexy part of the deal process. Getting the deal closed is much more exciting than, okay, now it's time to actually make it work. But it's where deals fail. So I think where things happen to be most successful, or coming back to it, alignment is ultimately, if the alignment is not there from the startup and the acquirer on why we're doing this deal and what we hope the outcome to look like. And I mean everything from, we want this, it's easy to gloss over, let's say a talent acquisition, where you say, we want this team to be our machine learning team within this larger organization. That sounds great. And on the surface, I think on both sides, the companies would say that sounds awesome. But the details are really where it comes into play. Who's going to lead that team? Is it going to be the CEO of the startup, or is it going to be the existing person that was leading it within the larger organization? Who's going to be the interface within the bigger company? Is the entire team going to be kept together, or are there going to be some other startup employee or other big company employees that join on as well? What does that look like? What did you feel? I mean, there's so many details that can be ironed out, and I think the devil is in the details on that. So when I say alignment, I mean alignment at that level of detail. Because it could be that the perception was, well, when you said that we would run the ML team, I thought this, but you actually meant that, and now I'm not happy. So I think that's where often things can get overlooked. So I think that's probably the most important thing. I think the other thing that can really drive success is really the leadership teams that are joining. I think one thing that I learned probably across all three companies pretty consistently was whether or not the founding team that was joining was going to be viewed as leaders within the organization, and whether or not they were going to be viewed as like really excellent, solid leaders and good culture fits was probably the second biggest driver of success. Because culture is really important for most startups, as it should be. And so if that alignment isn't there, and if those people are not given kind of the authority to be leaders within the broader company, it tends to just kind of disintegrate, maybe not as quickly, but over time. So I think that those are the two things that I would definitely call out. And then one final one would be the deal sponsor, and whether or not that person is actually able to be empowered to help this company be integrated. So sometimes what I've seen is an executive gets very excited about an acquisition, but they're probably not the one that's going to be doing the day-to-day handiwork of making sure that the company is well supported. So you really want someone who has the decision-making ability, but also will be the one that's going to be helping along the way.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Are there particular moments that have kind of stuck with you, and obviously anonymously is fine, of acquisitions where you're like, wow, that went really smoothly, that was a great one, or moments and the opposite where a founder did something where you're like, ooh, like that makes me a lot less excited about exploring this option?
Yeah, I won't name names. Obviously, your acquisition was just the worst. So, no, I think it comes back to me, trust. So there were moments, either in the negotiation process or after a term sheet was signed and kind of the detailed legal decision-making process where, a founder's true colors really showed. I think that's where, in some deals, I wouldn't say we ended up backing out post a term sheet because of any of that, but it definitely gave moments of pause. And it usually tended to be around things like, details that made the acquirer nervous for how the founder would act as part of the company. So really digging in on acceleration clauses because they were so focused on what happens if they leave the company. It's like, well, why are you so focused on wanting to leave this company? You haven't even gotten here yet. And again, it's a delicate topic, but you really just want to be authentic and just say, like, listen, here's where I'm coming from. Let me be vulnerable with you. Here's why I'm so nervous about this. But when people tended to get a little bit adversarial, I'll use that term again that you used, I think that's where it really gave pause. And then, being deceitful. Like if you ever find out along the way that, the company has not acted well or anything comes up that's, just not something that we'd want as part of our culture, it never looks good. And that's something that's cause for stopping anything at any point in the conversation.
Sure. One of the things I think I've seen, admittedly with many, many fewer data points than you have, is when startups are evaluating these offers, I think they fail to fully consider what it's actually going to be like to be at the company and how much they'll enjoy working at company A versus company B, or what their role will be at company A versus company B. And then it's actually much less about what are the strict economic terms of the deal.
Totally agree.
And much more about the integration story.
Because you could look at two acquisition offers that are, let's say, and I'm going to use random numbers, $10 million and $12 million. They could be, one company is a large public company, 50,000 people. The other one is a fledgling startup-ish, 500 people, private tech company that has a huge amount of upside. So financially, they're actually very different options, even if, they are both stock, let alone the fact that there's this $2 million delta. But then you're right. The other aspect is you're going to be working with these people. You're going to be living and breathing in this environment for hopefully 4 years, if not more. You got to take that into consideration. And so I think the challenge there is you as founders have to think about that, then you have to think about it for your team. So it's a lot to bear, but you definitely need to think about the holistic picture. It's not just the payout.
And are there things that you think founders can do to make the team particularly successful as part of the integration?
Yes. I mean, I do think that the founders have to be the advocates of their team. And I do think that's also where when you get into those nuanced details of what does the integration look like and what are all the alignment issues up front that we're discussing, it can be actually, it seems like the right answer is to keep my team completely insulated like we were before. We worked really well together. That sounds like the right answer, but oftentimes that's not setting your team up for success. That might sound best to you because you know how that works, but the team is not going to be as able to integrate into the larger company unless they have some infusion of the larger organization that joins. So I think you really do have to have the empathy of what the team is going through versus what it felt like to run your own company. Because ultimately, this is the decision to not have that title anymore. You're not running the company. I mean, sometimes you are, and it's a very separate organization, but usually you're probably somewhat integrated into the larger company or will be over time. So you have to start thinking through the mindset of what's going to make our team most successful versus what feels the most comfortable right now.
Makes total sense. Listen, you shared a lot of very, very helpful thoughts with us on M&A. I'd love actually to talk a little bit about the new chapter in your life, which you started this VC firm, focused on early stage investments in marketplace businesses. Are there particular types of companies or entrepreneurs you like to see when you're evaluating deals now from kind of the other side on the VC side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think getting back to kind of what the theme was that I saw, or one of the themes in integration, it was really rock star founders were one of the biggest indicators of success. And so often a lot of what I ended up spending my time on was really evaluating the founding teams more than anything, even if it was an acquisition that was targeted at the business itself. So I think that translates very well to early stage investing, because a lot of it, and oftentimes you don't actually have a product to evaluate, you don't have a user base to evaluate, you're really evaluating people and making an assessment on, do we think that this is a team that can actually make it big? And so that translates very well, and that's part of what drew me to starting Wave with my two partners, because I think that ultimately, working with people is part of, and working with founders is really what got me into corp dev from venture. So it's actually pretty fitting to go back to it.
Sure. Well, listen, Sara, thank you so much for spending time with us. Sara Adler from Wave Capital. Thanks again, Sara.
Thanks for having me.